Everyone in Miami Metro knew the name Bay Harbor Butcher. The legend starts in the dark water of Biscayne Bay, with a couple of divers expecting old tires and beer bottles, and instead brushing up against black plastic. They tug on one bag, it tears, and an arm floats out. Then another bag. Then another. Before long, the dive lights are cutting through a graveyard, dozens of dismembered bodies, sealed, stacked, and sunk like someone's private evidence locker. By the time those bags hit the dock, the media has already done what the media does. They slap a name on the monster. The Bay Harbor Butcher. Overnight, it goes from crime scene to urban legend. Talk radio, morning shows, every episode of the local news running the same creepy footage of body bags, lined up like a conveyor belt of horror. Everyone agrees on one thing. Whoever did this is not just a killer. He's methodical, disciplined, almost professional. And that's the paradox. The first thing we need to consider is that while Miami Metro is building a task force to hunt this new boogeyman, the real butcher is badging into the same building every morning. Dexter Morgan, blood spatter analyst, coffee in hand, cracking awkward jokes in the lab, is literally processing his own work. He's the guy explaining the patterns, while quietly making sure none of those patterns ever point back at him. From the outside, the setup looks perfect. Dexter has access to every file, every victim photo, every new lead that might get a little too close. He can nudge the case toward dead ends, invent a plausible excuse for missing evidence, and of course, play the harmless nerd role that makes everyone underestimate him. However, there's one problem Dexter doesn't account for. Sergeant James Dokes. From the beginning, Dokes is the outlier. Where everyone else sees a socially awkward lab tech, Dokes sees something strange, something off. He doesn't laugh at Dexter's jokes, he doesn't buy the shy routine, and every crime scene they share just makes his suspicion worse. For example, while the rest of the squad is freaked out by the Bay Harbor Butcher dump, Dexter looks almost fascinated by the precision. That's not normal, and Dokes knows what real predators look like. So here's the core question this whole video is built around. How does an investigation this massive get so close to the truth and still end with the wrong man wearing the label Bay Harbor Butcher? How do we go from Dokes' side, eyeing Dexter in one scene, to Dokes' face on the news as the official monster? And why does everyone, eventually, accept that version of the story? Over the rest of this breakdown, we're going to track the case from that first torn garbage bag all the way to the final cover story. We'll follow the task force as they build the butcher's profile, watch Dokes quietly build his own case on Dexter, and break down Dexter's countermoves at every step. By the end, we'll see exactly how the investigation almost exposed the real killer inside Miami Metro, and how it twisted just enough to bury that secret with Dokes' name on it instead. So to really understand how that happened, we're going to rebuild the Bay Harbor Butcher case file the way Miami Metro never could. Not as a simple plot recap, but as if we're sitting in the war room, flipping through every report, every dive log, every strange little note Dokes scribbled when no one was looking. The first thing we need to consider is that there are actually two investigations running at the same time. On paper, you've got the official Bay Harbor Butcher task force that launches the second those trash bags full of bodies come up from the ocean floor. Off the books, you've got Dokes treating Dexter himself as a walking crime scene. Same city, same killer, completely different target. We're going to move chronologically, but fast, almost like we're paging through a binder. For each major break in the case, we'll stop and ask three things. What did the task force see in the evidence? What did Dexter quietly do with that information? And what did Dokes notice that everyone else brushed off as Dexter just being creepy? That's where the real tension lives. Our core variables stay the same all the way through. First, the forensic evidence from the dump site, the plastic, the cut marks, the clean bloodless bodies that make no sense for a typical Miami killer. Second, the victim profiles, criminals who slipped through the cracks, which should have screamed someone inside the system is keeping score. Third, Dexter's access as a blood analyst, giving him a front row seat to his own manhunt. And finally, Dokes' Special Forces instincts, that combat honed read on human predators that keeps dragging his suspicion back to Dexter even when the case points somewhere else. For example, when the divers first surface with those bags. The task force starts thinking about boat access and disposal logistics. Dexter is thinking about what he left behind. Dokes is watching Dexter's face. That triangle, official theory, secret panic, and silent suspicion is the pattern we'll keep coming back to, episode after episode. However, this isn't just about evidence. We're going to track character psychology and institutional blind spots at the same time. Why does LaGuerta cling so hard to the idea of Dokes as the killer once the frame job lands? Why does Lundy's brilliant profile still miss the possibility that the butcher is literally standing at his crime board? And why is Dexter's helpful nerd act so effective on everyone except the one man whose own darkness recognizes it? Each major development becomes its own mini-arc. Discovery of the bodies, the task force forming, Dokes tailing Dexter, the cabin, the frame. We'll show how the case is solved on paper, with Dokes' name stamped on it, and how close he actually came to blowing up Dexter's secret life forever. By the end, the official story and the hidden story will be laid out side by side, and you'll see exactly where they stop matching. Before the Bay Harbor Butcher becomes a headline, he's just a rumor the city never bothers to tell, because at this point, there is no case. There's just Dexter Morgan, living a double life so clean it barely leaves a smudge on paper. By day, he's the quiet blood spatter analyst at Miami Metro, the guy who walks into a crime scene, tilts his head at the cast-off, and calmly explains exactly how the killer swung the weapon. He's useful, he's reliable, and, of course, he's the last person anyone would connect to a string of missing criminals. By night, that same expertise turns into choreography for murder. Dexter hunts people the courts failed, rapists, traffickers, corrupt killers who walked on technicalities, and applies his own code when the system taps out. The first thing we need to consider is how perfectly his day job feeds his night work. Dexter doesn't have to troll the streets for victims. The victims come to him in manila folders and evidence bags. He sees crime scene photos, reads case files, hears the off-the-record gossip about who got away with it. For example, when a suspect is released because a warrant was bad or a witness recants, everyone else just groans and moves on to the next file. Dexter quietly flags that name for later. His lab coat is basically camouflage for a predator operating in plain sight. And Miami Metro, unintentionally, benefits. That's the early irony the show leans into. Some of their worst open threats simply stop being a problem. A serial rapist who keeps slipping through lineup IDs disappears. A cartel enforcer everyone is too scared to testify against vanishes between episodes. No body, no crime scene, no new case number. Just a collective sigh of relief that the heat on those names suddenly cools down. However, because these are people the system already failed or quietly forgot, no one connects the pattern. There's no common victim profile anyone wants to defend. These aren't beloved college kids or tourists. They're predators, dealers, and killers with long records and short life expectancies. So when they go missing, it feels less like a mystery and more like karma doing paperwork. Who files a missing persons report on the guy who used to terrorize the neighborhood? Almost no one. Dexter's disposal method seals the illusion. Meticulous plastic wrap, careful dismemberment, and then the ocean. He turns the Atlantic into his personal evidence shredder. As long as those bags stay on the seabed, his secret is perfectly insulated. No bodies means no crime scenes, which means no Bay Harbor Butcher, not even as a nickname whispered in a briefing. But all of this is a temporary equilibrium. The moment divers accidentally find those bags off the coast, Dexter's private ritual becomes a public nightmare. The city gets a monster, the task force gets a mandate, and eventually, Dokes gets a target. The only question is how long Dexter can keep working the case of his own kills without the blood trail circling back to him. The moment that equilibrium shatters doesn't start with a dramatic chase or a tip from some confidential informant. It starts with a training exercise. A couple divers off Bay Harbor drop into the water to run boring drills, and instead, they literally kick the lid off Dexter's secret. The first thing we need to consider is how mundane that discovery looks at first. There's just this single black plastic bag, half buried in the silt, snagged on coral. It could be trash, right? Miami's water isn't exactly pristine. But when one diver tugs it loose, the bag doesn't flex like garbage. It's rigid, heavy, dead weight in the most literal way. They haul it up, clip it to the training boat, and that's where the scene really turns. On deck, the supervising officer slices the plastic open. No smell of decomp, no sloppy chainsaw hack job. Instead, we get dismembered limbs, pale and preserved, wrapped in neat layers of plastic like someone's doing vacuum-sealed meal prep for a very creepy freezer. The cuts are clean, joints separated with precision. This isn't rage. This is technique. Whoever did this knows anatomy and is way too comfortable processing a body after death. And then comes the pattern interrupt. One diver looks back over the side and notices another identical bag resting on the ocean floor below. Then, another, and another. As the camera pulls back in the episode, we see what they see, dozens of black shapes scattered across the seabed like an underwater graveyard. This isn't a body dump, it's a cemetery. By the time Miami Metro gets the call, the case has already jumped from weird to historic. In the squad room, we watch the photos hit the monitors one by one. At first, people assume it's multiple victims from one mass killing. However, as the evidence rolls in, the mood shifts. Different ages, different times of death. Different MOs on the original crimes that led these people here. The only consistent thing is the post-mortem work and the plastic. That's when it lands. They're not looking at one body. They're looking at years of kills, all meticulously packaged by a single methodical killer. Of course, that's catnip for the media. Overnight, headlines brand the unknown murderer the Bay Harbor Butcher, because nothing says nuanced reporting like a catchy nickname. The mayor's office freaks out, internal affairs starts sniffing around, and a high-profile task force is born to turn this PR disaster into a victory lap. But here's the real twist. While everyone else is horrified, Dexter is quietly terrified for a completely different reason. This isn't some new monster muscling in on his territory. This is his entire career, bobbing up to the surface in plastic bags. So how do you stand in the middle of a task force, hunting your own kills, and not flinch? That's the problem Dexter has to solve next. And unfortunately for him, Dokes is already watching every move. So Dexter's nightmare goes from private panic to official headline almost overnight. The second those trash bags hit the news, Miami Metro doesn't just have a case, it has a crisis. And Dexter is suddenly sitting in the middle of a war room, built to catch. Dexter. The first thing we need to consider is how fast the brass weaponized this. Captain Matthews smells politics all over it. A vigilante serial killer, dozens of bodies, national attention, that's career ending if they don't get a win. So he slaps the Bay Harbor Butcher label on it and orders a dedicated task force with LaGuerta front and center because she knows how to play the cameras as well as the crime scenes. When Special Agent Frank Lundy eventually arrives from the FBI, the message is clear. This is the top priority in Miami. Everything else moves around this case. Structurally, it looks impressive. Daily briefings, whiteboards full of victim photos, timelines, maps, psychological profiles, homicide detectives chasing leads, forensics combing every recovered bag, and the FBI building a profile of a highly organized killer who knows Miami's tides and patrol patterns. On paper, this is how you catch a ghost. In practice, they're handing that ghost a front row seat. Because Dexter isn't just in the room, he's the guy they keep turning to for answers. In one scene after another, he plays the helpful analyst, calmly breaking down cut marks, tool impressions, and blood traces, while internally running a completely different calculation. For example, when they note the uniformity of the dismemberment, Dexter is quietly checking which blades he used, which tables he cleaned, and whether any small deviation could bounce back to his ritual. Every new piece of evidence is a mirror he has to inspect without flinching. His strategy is simple on the surface: stay boring. Offer neutral observations, never push the narrative too hard, and let other people sound passionate or outraged. He corrects details, but never direction. However, under that flat delivery, he's cataloging patterns. Which victim lists they have, which they don't, how close Lundy's profile gets to forensic insider before veering back to mysterious drifter with a boat. And that's the early blind spot that keeps him alive. The task force assumes the butcher is an outsider predator, someone watching from the shadows, not clocking in with them every morning. Of course they're biased. Cops and techs are the good guys in their minds. They see Dexter as the creepy but reliable lab rat, not a suspect, so their profile keeps circling around ex-military contractors, disgruntled fishermen, anyone but the guy labeling their blood slides. Everyone except Dokes. He's not running the task force yet, but he's in the back of those briefings, arms crossed, eyes locked on Dexter instead of the evidence board. While Lundy talks about the killer's discipline, Dokes is watching Dexter's micro-reactions, comparing them to all those strange crime scene moments from earlier seasons. The case is supposed to be about the bodies in the bay, but for Dokes. It's also confirmation that his suspicion about this one analyst isn't going away. And eventually, that's going to push him way outside the task force playbook. Lundy talks about discipline, Dokes watches Dexter, and meanwhile, the evidence is quietly screaming something else. This isn't some messy spree killer. The first thing we need to consider is what those trash bags at the bottom of the bay actually say once the lab starts listening. Back at Miami Metro, the bags don't stay anonymous for long. Every single one is photographed, weighed, logged, limbs are laid out on stainless steel tables, tagged and cataloged, and almost immediately, a pattern jumps out. The cut, marks on a forearm from one bag, match the angle and depth of a leg from another. Same smooth disarticulation at the joints, same lack of hesitation, no defensive wounds. Different bodies, identical technique. This is not improvisation. This is muscle memory. For example, we see Masuka and the techs talking about how clean the cuts are, almost surgical. They're matching saw marks under magnification, realizing it's the same type of blade every time, applied with the same steady pressure. Even the wrapping is standardized, heavy plastic, double-layered, air pushed out, taped a specific way. It looks less like a murder dump and more like a system. Once they establish that ritual, the next step is turning body parts back into people. Fingerprints on preserved hands get run through AFIS. Dental records are compared tooth by tooth. missing persons reports start getting pulled, and the names that come back are not random Miami citizens. They're drug dealers, rapists, murderers who walked on technicalities. Guys who fell through the cracks of the system. The task force is supposed to be hunting a monster, but the database keeps handing them criminals the audience remembers from earlier episodes as the ones who got away. That victim pool shapes the early profile fast. Lundy lays it out: meticulous, intelligent offender, strong anatomical knowledge, maybe medical or forensic training. Someone local who knows Miami's criminal underbelly and has been operating for years without a single body turning up until now. However, that's only half the picture, because the other half is standing in the lab, already knowing exactly why those cuts look so familiar. Dexter's vantage point is brutal. He recognizes his own signature immediately, the way he severs limbs at the joints to minimize bone splintering, the precise spacing of the tape, even the order things are packed into the bags. But he has to talk about it like any other case. So he leans into the analyst role, pointing out how organized the killer is, how the dismemberment suggests planning and emotional control, while carefully not getting too specific about methods he's perfected over years. By the time this section of the investigation settles, the conclusion is unavoidable. This isn't a chaotic maniac lashing out at random. It's someone who studies, selects, and executes with a ritual he's refined. Someone who understands evidence as well as any cop in that task force briefing. And the really creepy part? As the profile gets sharper, we realize the killer it describes could easily be sitting in that very room, nodding along, helping everyone else feel like they're getting closer. And once that profile is on the board, the first thing we need to consider is what happens when the names behind those neatly labeled bags finally come back. Because as soon as the IDs start rolling in, the task force realizes this isn't just a graveyard, it's a failed docket. Analysts start with the obvious hits. One victim is a mid-level drug dealer whose trafficking case collapsed after a key witness vanished. Another is a murder suspect who walked when a confession got tossed on a technicality. Then there's the accused rapist whose charges were dropped when his victim got shredded on the stand. The more files they pull, the more it feels like they're reading a greatest hits compilation of Miami's worst repeat offenders, all of them people the system touched and then let drift away. On paper, it should be random. Different ages, different neighborhoods, different years. However, when they line up the rap sheets side by side, a pattern snaps into focus. The majority of these bodies belong to people with serious criminal histories, often with open warrants or cold cases shadowing their names. This isn't a killer cruising for strangers. This is someone hunting a very specific type of target, predators who slip through the cracks. That realization hits the briefing room like a strange, guilty relief. You can almost hear the unspoken excuse forming. For example, one detective mutters that the murdered rapist saved the state a trial. Another shrugs about a dead abuser, saying his wife's probably sleeping better. No one writes that in a report, of course, but the subtext is there. These victims aren't sympathetic. They're the mugshots everyone hated seeing walk out of court. But not everyone is comfortable with that quiet celebration. You have people like Lundy, who keeps repeating that pattern, or not. This is still homicide, and the law doesn't get to outsource justice to a mystery butcher with a boat. The ethical tension becomes its own character in the case. Is the Bay Harbor butcher a monster, or is he doing what a lot of people secretly wish they could do? That question explodes once details leak to the press. Headlines go from serial killer terrorizes Miami to underwater grave of human monsters. Talk radio callers start framing the butcher as some dark folk hero, cleaning up what Miami Metro couldn't. It's Dexter's worst nightmare and best cover story at the same time. public sympathy for the very code he lives by. And here's the really creepy part. The more they describe that code, only criminals, only those who escaped real consequences, the more they're sketching Dexter's psychology in real time. They're practically workshopping his inner rules on a whiteboard, not realizing the man they're profiling is sitting right there, nodding along, helping refine the theory. So what happens when someone in that room stops seeing a folk hero and starts seeing a very specific colleague instead? The answer walks in wearing a beige suit and a quiet stare. Enter Special Agent Frank Lundy. The first thing we need to consider is why the FBI shows up at all. By this point, the Bay Harbor Butcher isn't just a creepy local case, it's a national headline, a PR nightmare. Dozens of dismembered bodies pulled from the ocean, all in neat plastic. Miami Metro looks outmatched, so the Bureau sends in their serial killer whisperer, the guy who closes the cases that keep other agents up at night. Lundy doesn't storm in yelling. He does the opposite. Calm, methodical, almost grandfatherly. However, that's exactly what makes him dangerous. In his first briefing scenes, he's not impressed by the horror, he's impressed by the control. The consistency of the wrapping, the precision of the cuts, the way the dump site is both symbolic and efficient. This isn't chaos, this is a lifestyle. He immediately clocks what others only vaguely feel. The victims aren't random. Most are criminals who slipped through the cracks. For example, when the task force goes over rapists, traffickers, and killers who dodged conviction, Lundy doesn't call it coincidence. He calls it a moral pattern. He says they're dealing with an organized offender who has rules, maybe even a personal code that tells him who deserves to die. That reframes everything. Up to now, most people in the room secretly enjoy the folk hero idea. The vigilante fantasy. Lundy shuts that down without raising his voice. He tells them to stop thinking about a monster in the shadows and start thinking about a man with a mortgage, a job, and a routine. Someone integrated. Someone who can sit in traffic, grab coffee, and then go dismember a body like it's just another errand. Of course, that description lands uncomfortably close to Dexter. Lundy pushes long-term thinking. Assume the killer is patient. Assume he's been doing this for years. Assume he's smart enough to stay near the investigation to control information. He even floats the idea that the butcher might feel genuine satisfaction from correcting the justice system. Dexter is literally in the frame while Lundy paints that picture. Dexter's reaction is a split screen. Outwardly, he's respectful, curious, almost fanboying over this legendary FBI profiler. Inwardly, he's terrified, because Lundy is the first person whose psychological sketch could actually land on him if it goes one step further. It's not just a killer who likes blood. It's a controlled predator with a ritual, a code, and access. And while Lundy sharpens the official hunt, something else is happening off to the side. Dokes is watching Dexter, not the PowerPoint. Unfortunately for Dexter, Lundy is narrowing the type of man they're all looking for at the exact same time Dokes is narrowing it down to one specific man. The task force is chasing an idea. Dokes is quietly starting a different investigation entirely. So what happens when Lundy's polished profile and Dokes' raw suspicion finally collide over the same name? That collision doesn't start with evidence on a board. It starts with a feeling. And for James Dokes, that feeling goes way back, long before anyone ever says the words Bay Harbor Butcher. The first thing we need to consider is that Dokes never bought Dexter's harmless lab geek act. From the pilot, everybody else treats Dexter like the quirky office weirdo. Masuka cracks jokes, Deb leans on him, LaGuerta flirts. Dokes? He just stares. In scene after scene, he walks past Dexter and throws out lines like, "You're a creep, Morgan," with this dead serious disgust that nobody else shares. They laugh it off. He doesn't. That wasn't just personality clash. It was training. Dokes comes out of special forces, black ops work, places where you meet people who kill for a living and sleep fine at night. He's seen contract killers who smile too easily, soldiers who enjoy the firefights a little too much. After a while, you develop a sixth sense for the guy in the room who is way too calm when everyone else is on edge. For example, look at those early crime scenes. Where Batista is shaken and Deb is swearing, Dexter is fascinated. He's tracing blood patterns, talking about cast-off and arterial spray, like he's describing modern art. That detached commentary is exactly the kind of thing Dokes has heard from people who like violence but know how to dress it up in technical language. Of course, to the rest of the squad, Dexter is just being good at his job. To Dokes, that same behavior sounds like a confession he can't quite prove. In Season 1, Episode 7, when they investigate Jason R. at the college, we see this play out perfectly. Dexter is almost excited walking through the scene, reconstructing the attack, calling it simple and sloppy. Dokes watches him with that tight jaw, like he's back in some jungle village, watching a mercenary talk about bodies on the ground as targets. He can't name it yet, but the suspicion is already there. This guy is way too comfortable. However, at this stage, Dokes has no idea about the Bay Harbor butcher. The underwater graveyard hasn't been found. The task force doesn't exist. What he does know is that Dexter is hiding something dark. The fake smiles, the empty small talk, the way he's always present at death, but never affected by it, that combination is exactly what his special forces brain flags as dangerous. So when the butcher case finally explodes, it doesn't create Dokes' suspicion. It amplifies it. Suddenly, there's a meticulous killer out there. Someone disciplined, patient, organized, and right there in the middle of the task force is the one man Dokes already can't stop watching. That's the looming convergence, a massive serial killer case on one side, and a cop whose instincts are already locked on to the one person who absolutely cannot afford extra attention. The only question now is, when the bodies in the bay meet the bodies in Dexter's past, which investigation moves faster, Lundy's official manhunt or Dokes' private war? So while Lundy is building his dream task force and Dokes is running his private war, Dexter walks straight into the most dangerous place for a secret killer to be, the war room itself. He's not just in the building. He's in every briefing, every update, every new lead-on, himself. The first thing we need to consider is how powerful that seat at the table really is. We see Dexter in those Bay Harbor butcher briefings, apparently quiet, eyes down on the files. But he's not zoning out. He's doing threat assessment. Every time Masuka throws up a dump site map, Dexter is silently tracing currents, thinking about his boat, wondering which bag drifted too far. Every time Lundy updates the victim list, Dexter clocks which names could connect back to cases he worked, or to people who ever said his name out loud. And then come the defensive moves. Dexter can't just sit there. He has to steer. So when someone suggests a long-term organized offender, he casually nudges it toward maybe multiple killers using the same dump site. When Masuka points out consistency in the cut marks, Dexter shrugs it off as tool similarity that could come from any number of sources. It sounds like dry lab talk, but what he's really doing is sanding down the edges of a single focused profile that would eventually look exactly like him. He even weaponizes his own expertise. For example, we get those moments where Dexter misreads blood evidence just enough to blur a timeline, a cast-off pattern that might show a meticulous, ritualistic killer becomes a rushed, panicked attack, A clean arterial spray that screams control suddenly gets described as a messy struggle. Of course, nobody questions the blood guy. That's the whole problem. On top of that, there are the physical interventions. Small, quiet, terrifying. A swab that could be traced back to his boat never makes it from the scene to the lab. A fiber that looks a little too familiar gets accidentally cross-contaminated with something from an unrelated case. A photo angle that might show his specific knot or tape style just doesn't get prioritized. It's never the dramatic evidence dump, it's death by 1,000 missing details. Psychologically, it's an even tighter rope. Dexter has to appear helpful enough that Lundy keeps trusting him, while never being so insightful that he builds the perfect Bay Harbor butcher profile in front of everyone. So he plays the slightly baffled expert. Smart, but not visionary. He'll offer a solid observation, then immediately undercut it with uncertainty, as if to say, "What do I know? I just read the blood." However, every new ID, every new pattern Lundy circles on that board is a step closer to Dexter's real life. The case is tightening. Doak's suspicion is tightening. The question is, how long can Dexter keep the investigation just a few degrees off course before someone in that room finally notices the blood spatter analyst is describing himself? Because once that clicks for even one person, the war room stops being a shield and becomes his execution chamber. And this is where the investigation gets almost unfair for Dexter. Up to now, the task force has been stumbling around in the dark, but once those trash bags come up from the bottom of the bay, the first thing we need to consider is how fast Lundy turns chaos into a clock. He doesn't just see bodies, he sees a schedule. They start building a timeline, pinning every confirmed Bay Harbor butcher victim to a board, then working backward through missing persons reports, parole records, and cold case files. Years light up. This isn't a spree. It's a long-running operation. The creepy part? When they overlay that victim list with ocean currents and where the bags actually surfaced, a pattern snaps into place. The currents push everything back toward a few key channels near Miami. That tells Lundy the killer has been using the same general dump zone again and again, confident that the water would hide his secret. It's methodical, almost boringly consistent, which is exactly what makes it terrifying. From there, the geographic analysis gets even tighter. Most of the victims vanish in or around Miami-Dade, often within a pretty manageable radius of the station. That suggests the killer lives and works locally, knows the waterways, and has routine access to a boat. Not a flashy yacht with a name on the side. Something forgettable. Practical, of course. We already know Dexter's little slice of life fits that bill perfectly. But to them, it's just one more anonymous hull in a city full of them. Lundy pushes it further. If you're dismembering bodies this cleanly, you need privacy, time, and at least some basic surgical or butchering knowledge. Garage, warehouse, abandoned property, every option gets sketched onto a map. However, no matter how many circles they draw, they can't put a single name in the middle. There are no witnesses, no surviving victims, no partial escapes with a license plate or a face. The case has patterns, but no person. That's the part that drives everyone insane. They finally have a profile that feels specific and still can't attach it to a suspect or even a vehicle. The dump sites scream boat. The cuts scream discipline. The victim pool screams vigilante. But the forensic traces whisper nothing. It's like chasing a ghost that files his own evidence. Lundy almost sounds impressed. He tells the room the butcher has never broken pattern, never taken a sloppy risk, never deviated from his ritual. For example, he points out that the killer doesn't escalate the way most serials do, he maintains. That description accidentally doubles as a love letter to Dexter's code. And here's the twist. The first real cracks in that perfection won't come from a chart. While Lundy stares at currents and radiuses, Dokes is staring at Dexter. Every new line on the map just makes Dokes' suspicion feel less strange, because eventually, the investigation won't be about where the killer dumps his bodies. It'll be about who keeps vanishing from the office right before they do. So while Lundy is busy turning the ocean into a math problem, the rest of Miami starts losing its mind. The first thing we need to consider is that this is not just another serial killer case anymore. This is dozens of bodies in tidy plastic bags, national headlines, and a nickname catchy enough to make every city commissioner hear Bay Harbor Butcher and think re-election nightmare. We see it on screen in those briefing room scenes. Suddenly there are suits at the back wall, not just uniforms. City officials want progress reports, not theories. The FBI wants a clean resolution, something they can put on a podium. And the media? They're basically asking if Miami Metro has been napping while a vigilante killer cleaned up their old failures. You can feel the insult baked into every question. How long has this guy been working under your nose? That hits the detectives hard. For example, when they realize many of the victims are criminals who slipped through the system, it's not just a pattern, it's an indictment. Old cases they closed or never solved are now showing up as dismembered torsos. That's a professional punch to the gut. It forces everyone to wonder, did their mistakes literally get people chopped up and dumped in the bay? And that's where the emotional temperature spikes. The bullpen shifts from casual banter to this tight, brittle focus. Longer hours, no one going home on time, everyone chasing leads that would have been laughed off 2 episodes earlier. A jailhouse rumor? Run it down. A strange detail in a 5-year-old file? Reopen it. However, the biggest change is psychological. They start admitting the killer probably knows law enforcement procedure, maybe even evidence handling, maybe even someone like them. Of course, that line of thinking is Dexter's worst nightmare. The task force getting serious means his little improvisations stop working. Every new evidence bag is a potential landmine. When Lundy talks about the butcher's meticulous plastic wrap, Dexter isn't just analyzing, he's replaying his own muscle memory, checking for the one time he slipped. A stray fiber, a bad current, a wrong victim that ties back too close. We also see his excuses get thinner. He can't just vanish from the lab whenever he wants, because now every absence is logged, every analyst is needed. When he ducks out, it's noticed. That creepy overlap between his secret life and his day job is shrinking fast, and the walls of Miami Metro are starting to feel less like cover and more like a trap. And standing right in the middle of that tightening circle, Dokes, while everyone else is panicking about politics, Dokes is watching Dexter's reactions. Who flinches when Lundy mentions law enforcement training? Who looks a little too calm hearing about dismembered bodies? The case is about to stop being abstract geography and start colliding with Dexter's daily routine. And Dokes is the one who's going to shove those two worlds together until something breaks. And this is the moment where Dokes decides watching Dexter from across the bullpen is a waste of perfectly good paranoia. The Bay Harbor Butcher has just gone from rumor to reality, bodies in bags on the ocean floor, and while everyone else is staring at charts and tide maps, Dokes is staring at Dexter. The question is, when does that side-eye turn into full-on surveillance? The first thing we need to consider is that Dokes is Special Forces trained. Sitting still is not his style. Once Lundy starts describing the butcher as methodical, disciplined, maybe even law enforcement adjacent, Dokes looks around the room and realizes only one lab geek fits that profile. So he escalates. We start seeing him parked outside Dexter's apartment, tailing him after work, memorizing his routines. Dexter goes for a late-night drive. Dokes is 2 cars back with his lights off. For example, Dexter's eye was out sailing. Excuse might work on Rita, but it does nothing for a guy who's spent years tracking insurgents. Dokes clocks the strange detours, the sudden exits from family dinners, the way Dexter's always just a little too unavailable right before a new body drops. There's that stretch where Dexter claims he's going to meetings. Dokes follows, watches him walk into a church basement, and then never actually sees him attend a meeting. That gap between Dexter's mild, recovering addict persona and his real nocturnal schedule only deepens the suspicion. We also get those great scenes where Dokes confronts him directly, then files away every micro-reaction. In one episode, Dexter brushes off a late night with a vague lab work line. But Dokes knows the lab was dark. In another scene, Dexter claims he can't remember a street he supposedly drove down, which is ridiculous for a guy whose brain is basically a GPS for murder. However, what really sells it for Dokes is the vibe, the flat tone, the dead eyes behind the smile, the way Dexter never seems truly surprised by violence. This is where Dokes starts drifting away from his own department. While Lundy and the task force chase boat registries and ocean currents, Dokes is burning gas and overtime watching a blood analyst who technically has no official link to the case. Colleagues roll their eyes. LaGuerta warns him he's obsessing. Even Deb pushes back, because from the outside, it looks like a personal vendetta, not police work. Unfortunately for Dokes, I just know he's a killer is not a great line to put in a report. Meanwhile, Dexter feels it. The shadow in the rearview mirror, the unannounced pop-ins at the lab. Now he's juggling 2 fronts, manipulating the Bay Harbor Butcher evidence on one side and managing Dokes' relentless presence on the other. It becomes a psychological duel, darkness recognizing darkness, each man testing the other's limits. And eventually, these 2 investigations, the public hunt for the Butcher and Dokes' secret hunt for Dexter, are going to slam into each other so hard that only one story can survive. And this is where those 2 storylines finally collide in the same room. On one side, you've got Miami Metro's shiny new Bay Harbor Butcher task force. On the other, you've got Dokes, sitting in those briefings, quietly realizing that the monster everyone's hunting might be sitting 3 chairs away, pretending to take notes. The first thing we need to consider is how strange this setup really is. Dexter is literally the blood spatter analyst for a case about a meticulous dismemberment killer, and the task force treats him like their forensic GPS. They wheel in photos of the underwater dump site, lay out slides of plastic-wrapped torsos, and then turn to Dexter for the science. Dokes is there too, ostensibly focusing on leads and suspects, but his attention is split. Half on the projector, half on Dexter's face. Everyone else in the room hears precision cuts, no defensive wounds, victims with criminal histories. They're thinking vigilante, ex-cop, maybe some survivalist with a boat. Dokes hears the same profile, but he's cross-referencing it with every creepy scene he's watched Dexter float through. For example, those times Dexter called brutal murders neat or interesting, or reenacted attacks with way too much enthusiasm. The task force is building a psychological profile of a killer. Dokes is mentally overlaying it onto the lab geek who never quite blinks at the right time. There are these little moments in the briefing room that really sell it. Lundy will click to a new slide, show a close-up of a perfectly wrapped garbage bag fished from the bay, and everyone leans forward to study the evidence. Dokes leans sideways instead, watching Dexter. He's not listening for what Dexter says, as much as how fast he says it. Does he answer before the question's even finished? Does he look surprised when they reveal a new victim, or does he look like he's remembering them? However, Dokes isn't at the Dexter is the Bay Harbor Butcher stage yet. Not out loud. What he has is this gut-level unease that keeps getting louder every time the profile gets more specific. Ex-military precision. Emotional detachment. A killer who understands blood the way other people understand sports scores. Of course, that lines up disturbingly well with the guy who abandoned a promising medical path to hang out with crime scene photos all day. Then, we get a near miss that almost blows everything open. During one briefing, they walk through the victimology. Criminals who slipped through the cracks, repeat offenders who deserved worse than they got. You can feel the room quietly agreeing with that logic. Dokes glances at Dexter right as this is said, and for a split second, Dexter's mask slips into something like satisfaction before he forces a neutral look again. Dokes clocks it. You can see the wheels turning. This isn't just a creepy lab rat. This is someone who believes in that code. The connection is almost there. A vigilante killer targeting the same people Dexter always seems a little too comfortable around. A blood expert who never flinches at dismemberment. A cop who can't shake the feeling that he's already met this darkness before. The only question now is, what happens the first time Dokes tests that theory outside the safety of a briefing room? That tension Dokes feels in the briefing room. Lundy is about to put it into words, and the scary part is, his words describe Dexter almost perfectly without ever saying his name. The first thing we need to consider is how much sharper Lundy's profile gets once the task force starts digging into the Bay Harbor Butcher's victim pool. When he realizes most of the victims are criminals who slipped through the cracks. He updates the profile. A white male, mid-30s to 40s, highly intelligent, methodical, probably working in law, medicine, or forensics. Someone with access to case files, someone who understands procedure well enough to dance around it, and crucially, someone with a rigid sense of moral order. This is not a guy killing for fun. Lundy keeps stressing that. In briefing after briefing, he frames the butcher as a person who sees himself as a necessary force, correcting the failures of the justice system. Not a sadist. Not a thrill killer. More like a self-appointed executioner who genuinely believes he's making Miami safer. In one scene, you can almost hear the subtext. This man isn't hiding from justice. He believes he is justice. Now lay that over Dexter. White male, mid-30s, quiet, intelligent, methodical to the point of obsession. Employed directly inside Miami Metro as a blood spatter analyst. Of course, he has access to files, crime scene photos, and every detail of every case. And he doesn't just have a vague sense of right and wrong, he has Harry's code, a literal checklist of who deserves to die. For example, we've already seen Dexter stalk rapists, killers, and abusers who walked on technicalities, then wrap them in plastic and dump them in the exact ocean grave the task force is now combing. The profile is practically a sketch of Dexter, with the name blurred out. So why doesn't anyone color it in? This is where cognitive bias kicks in. The team knows Dexter as the helpful lab guy, the one who brings donuts, makes awkward jokes, and works late to process blood slides. He's strange, sure, but in a socially anxious, creepy uncle at Thanksgiving way, not in a disciplined serial killer way. Familiarity protects him. They've already filed him under harmless. Masaka's crudeness becomes a weird kind of cover too. Next to Vince's sex jokes, Dexter's flat affect just reads as nerdy. When someone is that useful on a case, that available, that eager to help, the default assumption is loyalty, not homicide. However, Lundy's accuracy creates a quiet, growing danger. Because what happens when someone like Dokes, who already sees through Dexter's nice guy act, takes that profile home and really thinks about it? A vigilante targeting criminals, a forensics insider, a man with a secret life. Eventually, the only real question is, how long before Dokes stops calling Dexter a creep and starts calling him the Bay Harbor Butcher? And once he does, what's his first move? Go to Lundy or go straight to Dexter? If Dokes is closing in from the present, the first thing we need to consider is that Dexter's real nightmare is actually behind him. The Bay Harbor Butcher file is supposed to be about recent kills, fresh bags on the ocean floor. But as the task force digs, little fragments of Dexter's past start drifting up with the bodies. Lundy's team begins expanding the victim timeline, pushing back earlier than anyone expected. What was supposed to be a 2 or 3 year run suddenly looks older, more established, almost practiced. They start clocking victims whose remains show earlier plastic, slightly different tape. Tiny changes in cut patterns that hint at Dexter's first kills. For example, we get mentions of missing predators from years ago, guys who vanished long before Bay Harbor was on anyone's radar. To the task force, it's just a longer operational history. To Dexter, it's his training wheels showing. And then it gets creepier. Some of these names and faces brush up against cases Harry Morgan once worked. Old reports, half-closed files, criminals Harry watched walk free. On paper, it's coincidence. Off paper, we know it's literally the code in action. Harry pointing at monsters, Dexter taking notes, then taking trophies. So when Lundy casually references an ancient case Harry caught on patrol. And now that Perp is surfacing as a Bay Harbor Butcher victim, we're hearing an echo of those garage lessons Harry gave Dexter as a teenager. Dexter can hear it too, and that's where the fear kicks in. If they keep walking backward through this pattern, they don't just find more victims. They start bumping into his origin story, Harry's old case files. The neighborhood where young Dexter watched his first crime scenes. The exact kind of trauma Lundy loves to plug into his psychological profile. However, none of that fully clicks for the task force. They're busy chasing the vigilante angle and refining their forensics insider theory. They don't realize how close they are to the Morgan family scrapbook. There's a great unspoken tension here. Lundy is building a profile that accidentally describes Harry's private project, a controlled killer raised under a cop's supervision. Dexter knows that if anyone ever cross-references the Butcher's earliest victims with Harry's old frustrations, the whole code stops being a secret and becomes Exhibit A. You can almost feel him mentally editing his own childhood, trying to remember which scenes left paper trails. So he doubles down on misdirection. He feeds Lundy angles that stay in the present, nudges conversations away from older files, and lets Dokes' aggression become the more convenient story. Unfortunately for Dexter, the real turning point isn't hiding in a dusty box at Miami Metro. It's racing toward him in real time. Because the case is about to stop being a puzzle of old bodies and become something much worse, a very current, very personal kidnapping that drags Dexter out of the shadows and forces the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation into his actual life. And that, when it hits, is where everything breaks. And that, when it hits, doesn't just break the case. It crashes straight into a department that's already bleeding from the last big monster they chased. Because the first thing we need to consider is where Miami Metro's head is at when those garbage bags surface in the bay. They're not a fresh, rested squad ready for a brand new puzzle. They've just survived the ice truck killer. They've had press conferences, internal reviews, Deb's abduction, LaGuerta's political fallout, and a city asking whether its cops can actually keep anyone safe. On paper, they won. The ice truck killer is dead. The bodies are explained, the narrative is wrapped. But you can feel it in every scene after that. This is a department running on fumes. That recent victory becomes a double-edged knife. On one side, they're desperate to prove the ice truck case wasn't a fluke. On the other, they're exhausted and primed to see every new killer through that same lens. Another flashy serial killer? Of course Miami gets a sequel. So when divers pull up those dismembered bodies in plastic, leadership doesn't just see evidence. They see headlines. They see the mayor calling. They see their jobs. That's why the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force is framed almost like a redemption tour. We nailed the ice truck killer. We can nail this guy too. However, that mindset quietly blinds them. Instead of asking, what if this killer is something totally different? They keep reaching for the last script that made sense. And sitting right in the middle of that script is Dexter. The ice truck case quietly rewrites his place in the building. He was crucial behind the scenes, connecting patterns, walking them through blood evidence, even when the killer turned out to be his own brother. But publicly, he's the weird lab guy who did his job and never made it about himself. That combination is deadly for suspicion. Reliable, but low-key. Essential, but invisible. For example, Deb literally survives a serial killer who is obsessed with Dexter, and no one walks away saying, maybe we should look closer at the brother. Instead, it becomes proof that Dexter is a victim by proximity, not a potential killer. His creepy calm under pressure can be brushed off as experience now, not a red flag. Institutional pride locks that in. If the Bay Harbor Butcher turns out to be one of their own, then the ice truck victory doesn't look like competence. It looks like luck. So the search is aimed outward. Ex-cons, smugglers, vigilantes, anyone but the people with badges. Unfortunately for Dokes, that means the one guy who actually fits the profile is also the one guy the system is most invested in protecting. And the irony is brutal. The more they lean on Dexter as their best tool against the Butcher, the more they armor him against being seen as the Butcher. The question is, what happens when one cop refuses to play along with that story? So when one cop refuses to play along with the Dexter the hero story, what does he do next? In Dokes' case, he does the one thing guaranteed to blow back on him later. He goes off the books. The first thing we need to consider is how deliberate that choice is. This isn't a hothead outburst. This is a special forces guy deciding the system is compromised, so he's going to run his own parallel case on Dexter. He starts where any good investigator would start. Paper. Background checks, employment history, old academy files, anything with Dexter Morgan or Harry Morgan on it. And immediately, the records are strange. Dexter's spotless work evaluations don't match the creepy vibe Dokes gets in every episode. There's that abandoned medical track, the sudden pivot into blood work, the way Harry's notes are either glowing or sealed. For example, when he sees references to Harry personally sponsoring Dexter into Miami Metro, it doesn't read like mentorship. It reads like protection. Why does a dead cop still have this much invisible pull? From there, Dokes escalates. If the files don't tell the whole secret, the streets will. He starts tailing Dexter more aggressively, not just watching him leave work, but following him through those late-night drives that Dexter usually uses for stalking new targets. In one scene, Dexter pulls into a quiet area to surveil a potential killer, only to clock Dokes' car in the rearview and abort. That's not just annoying. For Dexter, that's a direct threat to his survival routine. We see this pattern play out multiple times. Dexter lines up a kill room, and suddenly Dokes is in the neighborhood on patrol. Dexter parks near a suspect's house, and Dokes walks up to the window, pretending it's a casual encounter. However, from the outside, none of this looks like heroic detective work. It looks like harassment. And that's the tragedy. On paper, you've got a sergeant ignoring orders, blowing off the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force briefings, and burning overtime to stock a civilian lab tech with no official case number, no warrant, no reports. Just I know that creep is hiding something. How does that sound in an IA interview? Unfortunately, it sounds like obsession. Colleagues see a guy who won't let go of a personal grudge. Matthews and LaGuerta see a liability. Even Deb, who should be the one person open to the idea that Dexter has a dark side, just sees her brother being bullied by a cop with anger issues. But the more right Dokes is, the more wrong he looks. Every time he blocks Dexter from a kill, Dexter's alibi is cleaner. Every time he confronts Dexter in a parking lot, it creates a future quote for, "See? He was fixated." It's the perfect foundation to eventually paint him as the Bay Harbor Butcher. So, we reach a breaking point. Dokes is closing in, but he's also isolating himself. How long can those two trajectories run side by side before they collide? Either he catches Dexter in the act, or Dexter finally decides the only real loose end in Miami is wearing a badge and saying his name out loud. So while Dokes is out there practically orbiting Dexter like an angry satellite, the official Bay Harbor Butcher machine is finally humming. The task force has a conference room, a board full of faces, and a stack of files that gets heavier every day. On paper, this is Miami Metro at its most organized. In practice, it's a well-oiled engine driving slightly in the wrong direction. The first thing we need to consider is the day-to-day grind that locks everyone into a rhythm. Every morning, they're in those victim ID meetings, going name by name through the bodies fished out of the bay. They cross-reference missing persons, sealed case files, and old arrest reports. Almost every match comes back the same way. Drug trafficker, rapist, killer who walked on a technicality. Each new photo on the board quietly repeats the same message. This isn't random. Someone is cleaning house. Out of that repetition, a working theory hardens. The butcher is almost certainly a lone operator. The cuts are precise, the dump site is consistent, the pattern is disciplined. However, there's also clearly law enforcement knowledge at play. The butcher understands case backlogs, evidence handling, even which criminals slip through specific prosecutorial cracks. The task force leans toward an ex-cop, ex-military, or maybe a private security contractor who washed out but kept the training, and that theory shapes everything. For example, when they start triaging leads, anyone with a quiet 9-to-5 and no record goes straight to the bottom of the pile. They run background checks on discharged soldiers with PTSD, former officers with brutality complaints, and bodyguards who lost clients in suspicious shootings. They're interviewing bouncers, mercenaries, and guys who brag about kills from overseas tours. Nobody is asking, "Hey, what about the blood guy down the hall who never raises his voice?" Meanwhile, field interviews with the victims' families keep feeding the same loop. You get grieving sisters saying, "He was no angel, but he didn't deserve this," and retired detectives muttering that the victim should have gone away for life. Every conversation reinforces the vigilante narrative. Unfortunately, that creates a strange comfort. At a distance, a good guy killer is almost palatable, as long as he stays theoretical and far away from the break room. This is where confirmation bias really bites. Each time a new body is identified as another criminal who slipped through the system, the task force feels more justified. Their profile looks right, so they keep polishing it instead of questioning it. Dexter, with his clean record, lab coat, and helpful smile, fits exactly none of those boxes. The case is literally sitting on his desk, and he still doesn't ping the radar. Contrast that with Dokes, whose radar is basically just one giant Dexter-shaped blip. While the task force debates ex-rangers and disgraced patrolmen, He's burning his off hours, tailing a blood spatter analyst, clocking every strange absence and creepy coincidence. It's tunnel vision versus institutional vision, and they're about to collide. Because eventually, those two tracks have to intersect. The moment the official profile even brushes against Dexter's real life, the entire case and everyone working it is going to get dragged into the blast radius. Those two tracks finally intersect when the investigation stops being abstract and hits Dexter right where he lives. It's not a new dump site, not a fresh set of weighted bags. It's Deborah Morgan, snatched off the board, and suddenly the Bay Harbor butcher case isn't just a manhunt anymore. It's a hostage situation, with Dexter's emotional weak spot at the center. The first thing we need to consider is why Deb is such a perfect target in this moment. She's riding high off major cases. She's attached to the butcher task force by proximity and reputation, and she's loudly, visibly connected to Dexter in every squad room scene. For any predator watching Miami Metro, grabbing Deb is like grabbing the department's exposed nerve. For Dexter, of course, it's worse. Deb isn't just his sister. She's the one person whose pain actually cuts through the code. And all of this lands right when the Bay Harbor butcher workload explodes. Bodies from the ocean are still being processed, victim profiles are being built, and every detective is logging insane overtime. That means the usual chaos Dexter hides behind, random late nights, strange disappearances, vague lab work excuses, suddenly stands out more. When everyone's chained to the task force, any absence is a red flag. If the blood guy vanishes in the middle of a serial killer emergency, people notice. This is where Dexter's double life stops being elegant and starts looking sloppy. He has to choose, stay in his lane as the quiet analyst, or blow up his patterns to save Deb. There is no version where he calmly finishes a blood report while his sister is missing. So he starts doing the one thing he usually avoids, acting like a frantic brother instead of a controlled predator. He pushes, he leaves, he shows up in places he shouldn't be. And he doesn't have time to craft a perfect excuse for every move. However, remember who's been clocking those moves already. Dokes is in full tunnel vision mode, watching Dexter the way the task force is watching the butcher. When Deb is taken, that pressure cooker just gets a lid welded on. In every briefing scene, Dokes can see the gap between how worried Dexter pretends to be and how strategically he actually behaves. For example, if Dexter ducks out right when a lead on Deb comes in, or arrives at a scene ahead of the responding units, that's not grief. That's intel. This overlap is deadly for Dexter because it weaponizes his humanity. The one time he lets emotion override the code, he hands Dokes a front row seat to his strangest behavior. Every unexplained gap, every creepy moment of calm in the middle of panic feeds the existing suspicion that Dexter is hiding a much bigger secret than social awkwardness. And as the rescue mission ramps up, we're watching the exact nightmare scenario form. Dexter's need to save family on a collision course, with his need to stay an invisible killer, all unfolding under the gaze of the one man who has been waiting for him to slip. The only real question is, when he finally moves to save Deb, who's actually going to catch him first? And the answer comes in one of the most replayed moments of the entire series. The first thing we need to consider is the pressure cooker Dexter is in by this point. Deborah is missing, the ice truck killer is taunting Miami Metro, and Dexter is trying to juggle his secret life with a very real deadline on his sisters. So when he races out into the night to track down Deb, he cuts corners he would never risk during a normal hunt. No careful surveillance, no slow stalking, just straight to the dockside kill zone in the middle of the night. That's the problem. Dexter ends up exactly where he absolutely should not be, exactly when he should not be there. In any other episode, he'd keep his predator side separate from his family side. Here, those lines blur. He's sneaking around a creepy, empty shipping yard, surrounded by containers and shadows, emotionally rattled instead of cold and clinical. And of course, that is the one night someone decides to follow him. Enter Dokes. Officially, he's supposed to be working the case with the rest of the team. However, his instincts have been screaming about Dexter for weeks, and he ignores the standard playbook to run his own tale. No warrant, no backup, just a special forces veteran quietly shadowing the lab geek who never quite adds up. He watches Dexter peel away from normal routes, clocking the strange detour straight to the waterfront. By the time Dexter reaches the scene, his mask is already slipping. He's in full panic mode, scanning for Deb, weapon ready, body language reading more like a hunter than a brother. This is where the show gives us that perfect collision, as Dexter is mid-action. Caught in a posture that looks nothing like a harmless analyst, Dokes steps out of the dark with that legendary line, "Surprise, mother." It's not just a meme moment, it's a forensic moment for Dokes' brain. He's catching Dexter red-handed, even if there's no literal blood yet. Dexter scrambles for an excuse, but the cover story is weak. Instead of the usual calm, detailed lie, he babbles about following a lead, checking on Deb, being worried, for example. Earlier, he could spin elaborate stories about blood work or late-night lab tests. Here, he can barely string together something that explains why he's alone, armed, and vibrating with adrenaline. Dokes doesn't have full proof, but his reaction tells us everything. He circles Dexter like he's sizing up another killer, not a coworker. The setting, the hour, the weapon, the look in Dexter's eyes, this is the first time the entire context screams predator. The creepy vibe suddenly has teeth. From this point on, Dexter isn't just a weirdo in the lab, connected to a big case. He's now a man Dokes can realistically imagine as the Bay Harbor butcher, someone who lies easily, moves like a professional, and just happened to be in a perfect killing ground when no one else was supposed to be there. Unfortunately for both of them, Dokes won't let that image go, and the next time he corners Dexter, it won't just be over a suspicious late-night walk. So, when Dexter finally has to explain why he was alone in a warehouse district with a murder kit while Debra was being held hostage, he doesn't exactly deliver a rock-solid narrative. He delivers vibes. And for a cop like Dokes, vibes are not going to cut it. The first thing we need to consider is how Dexter frames the whole kidnapping crisis afterward. To Miami Metro, he leans on the same soft focus excuse over and over. He was following a hunch. He was in the wrong place at the right time. He was just trying to help. No clear lead, no documented call, no partner who can back him up. Just this vague story about chasing something that didn't feel right and stumbling into the right shipping yard. On paper, it sounds heroic, but when you slow it down, it's incredibly thin. And that thinness clashes hard with the Dexter everyone thinks they know. This is the guy who lectures rookies about procedure, who usually hides behind lab reports and chain of custody forms. He's cautious, methodical, almost boring. Then, suddenly, in this episode, he's John McClane, crashing through a kidnapping scene on pure instinct. That character shift is exactly the strange, creepy kind of thing that lights up Dokes' radar. For example, when Dokes corners Dexter afterward and asks, "What made you go there?" specifically, Dexter has nothing concrete. He shrugs, he hedges, he tosses out generic lines about patterns and gut feelings. Dokes pushes for times, names, anything he can actually write in a report. Dexter keeps it foggy, because the real answer is, I was hunting a killer while being a killer. This is where Dokes' interrogation style really kicks in. He's not just listening to the words, he's watching Dexter's shoulders stay a little too tight, noticing how Dexter's eyes dart when the questions get close to the truth. Dokes mentally logs every inconsistency: the missing window of time before the crisis, the lack of a call to dispatch, the fact that Dexter's story never quite lines up with radio traffic. However, he doesn't blow up the room yet. He stores it, like evidence, for later. Meanwhile, the rest of the department practically begs to let it slide. Deborah's alive, the kidnapper's dead, and the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force has bigger monsters to chase. Nobody wants to pick apart the fairy tale that ends with their colleague safe. LaGuerta wants a clean narrative for the press. Deb wants to believe her brother is just a messed up hero. And even Lundy is more focused on the ocean full of bodies than one analyst's strange night. Here's the pattern interrupt. For everyone else, this is closure. For Dokes, it's an opening. This isn't another creepy moment to complain about in the hallway. This is a tactical shift. From this point on, he's not just suspicious of Dexter. He's actively hunting proof that the Bay Harbor Butcher is sitting in his own bullpen. So while Dokes quietly flips that internal switch from this guy's a creep to this guy's a killer, Miami Metro does the most Miami Metro thing possible. It keeps grinding forward like nothing changed. The first thing we need to consider is how bureaucracies move versus how obsessed individuals move. On paper, the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force is thriving. Lundy's got a full war room now. Victim photos on corkboards, strings mapping dump site currents, timelines pinned down to specific tides. They're cross-referencing missing offenders, parole records, and unsolved assaults, and every episode we see that board get more crowded and more organized at the same time. For example, Lundy refines the victim list into a very specific pattern: criminals who slip through the cracks. To him, that screams vigilante, but not guy who jokes about blood in our own lab. In one scene, he literally walks past Dexter while explaining that the butcher is likely a loner, meticulous, maybe with law enforcement knowledge, but not actually embedded inside the team. Dexter standing right there, stapling photos, basically invisible because he's helpful, polite, and delivering clean forensics on demand. The kidnapping fallout? Officially, that becomes a closed chapter. Deb is safe, the task force survived a scare, and everyone is eager to put that trauma in a box. Lundy treats it as a stress test, not a clue. The butcher didn't strike during the chaos, so in his mind that reinforces the idea of a distant, methodical outsider who waits for the perfect moment. No one logs Dexter vanished and came back with a terrible furniture excuse as evidence. It's just another strange day at Miami Metro. However, Dokes is done filing Dexter under strange but harmless. From this point on, his mental energy shifts. He's spending less time on the broad suspect pool Lundy keeps pushing, and more time replaying Dexter's behavior patterns. Every past crime scene, every creepy comment, every time Dexter got a little too excited about arterial spray, now looks like rehearsal for something much bigger. Watch how the camera starts to favor Dokes' POV at scenes. In one episode, Dexter walks a detective through cast-off patterns, almost gleeful, and we cut to Dokes studying him instead of the blood. Later, when Dexter calls a brutal kill child's play, that line lands differently. Before, Dokes just snapped back. Now, he files it away like a statement of capability. This is darkness, recognizing darkness and taking notes. And this divergence is exactly what will be weaponized. On one track, we have the polished federal narrative building toward a faceless monster in the Bay. On the other, a lone sergeant building a private case on a coworker no one else suspects. So what happens when the task force suddenly needs a name, a body, and a neat ending for the Bay Harbor Butcher case. And the only person yelling Dexter is already the department's favorite problem. So while the feds are busy workshopping their faceless monster narrative, the ocean itself starts snitching. The Bay Harbor Butcher case stops being abstract the second those bags hit a lab table and a current map, because now the investigation can chase physics instead of rumors. The first thing we need to consider is how embarrassingly specific plastic can be. Those body bags Dexter seals so carefully, they're not random. Forensics pulls brand, resin code, even the exact gauge of the plastic. It's a commercial grade, heavy mill liner sold in bulk to contractors and marinas, not something you casually grab at a grocery store. That instantly narrows the field. Now the task force is pulling purchase orders, distribution lists, and credit records, asking which Miami area businesses ordered this brand in the last few years. For example, we see investigators matching lot numbers to a handful of regional suppliers, then cross-referencing which retail locations actually stocked that model. Suddenly, the anyone in Miami killer shrinks to someone who shops at these 12 places. It's not a name yet, but it's a shopping habit, a pattern, a supply chain. And Dexter, who thought of those bags as anonymous armor, is now watching his own trash become a paper trail. However, the bags are only half the problem. The other half is where they end up. Oceanographers get pulled in to model currents in the bay, plugging in wind data, tides, and depth to backtrack the drift of those weighted bundles. This isn't TV magic. It gives a probable drop zone, a rough rectangle on the water where the butcher's boat would have been when he dumped. That rectangle lines up with specific channels, specific marinas, and specific fuel docks. In one scene, charts are spread across the war room table, and you can practically feel Dexter's stomach drop. The lines the scientists draw, they're basically tracing his nighttime commute. The models suggest a launch point consistent with a limited set of marinas, so the task force does the obvious next step. They start pulling boat records. Now, boat ownership becomes its own lead category. They're compiling lists of registered vessels that fit the likely size and range, flagging owners who live alone, work odd hours, or have any connection to law enforcement or prior violent cases. It's a crude Bay Harbor Butcher profile laid over a boating registry. Of course, sitting right in that Venn diagram is one blood spatter analyst with a suspiciously clean fishing boat. This is where Dexter's anxiety stops being abstract dread and turns into logistical crisis. He owns a boat. He uses it for dumps. And now his coworkers are casually asking about slip numbers, maintenance records, and hey, where do you usually take her out? Every innocent question is a landmine. He has to offer just enough detail to seem normal without inviting anyone to actually look at his specific vessel. Unfortunately for him, these leads don't say Dexter Morgan yet, but they erase his margin for error. The case has gone from hunting a myth to auditing a finite list of boat owners. All it takes is one more connection, a fuel receipt, a security camera, a dockhand with a good memory, and the faceless monster in the bay suddenly looks a lot like the guy reading the blood at every scene. So when the task force turns from boats and bags to the one thing the butcher can't control, his victim stories, that's when the investigation really starts breathing down Dexter's neck. And that's exactly where things get dangerous for Dexter. Because once you listen to the victims, you have to start asking the ugly question, who knew all this? Who knew their files, their failures, their loose ends? The first thing we need to consider is that every one of those answers points straight back to law enforcement. Lundy is the one who finally says the quiet part out loud. In that conference room, surrounded by boxes of files and a wall of mugshots, he walks them through it like a lecture. The killer anticipates search patterns, knows how long evidence is stored, understands which cases fell through the cracks. That's not random. That's not some dock worker with a grudge. That sounds like a cop. Or, even worse, someone behind the scenes with access to everything, like a forensic tech. You can feel the air change in the room. Suddenly, this isn't just a monster in the bay. It's the possibility of a monster at the next desk. Batista shifts in his chair. Deb looks away. Even LaGuerta doesn't rush to spin it. No one wants the headline to be Miami Metro breeds serial killer. So the idea is acknowledged, technically. But you can tell no one is eager to live in that reality for more than a minute. However, once you say inside job, that should, on paper, put people like Dexter right at the center of the watch list. He's literally the blood guy on the Bay Harbor butcher case. He knows every dump site, every victim, every forensic blind spot. If this were a different show, this is where someone would go, wait, why is the blood spatter analyst always perfectly calm about a mass grave of dismembered bodies? Instead, the task force does something very human and very convenient. They interpret cop as obvious cop type. For example, they pull IA files, disciplinary reports, officer-involved shootings. They look for hotheads, brutality complaints, anyone with a documented violent streak, guys who drank too much, blew up on suspects, maybe had a messy divorce. People who look like dokes on paper, not Dexter. And Dexter? He gives them nothing. This is where his performance is almost too good. He's present at every briefing, asking the right questions, volunteering for extra lab work, staying late to help Lundy. He acts just concerned enough, never defensive. Always the eager team player. When Lundy floats the law enforcement theory, Dexter doesn't flinch. He leans in, offers to cross-check old casework, basically volunteering to audit himself. It's a brilliant excuse to stay inside the investigation, and, of course, it completely disarms casual suspicion. Here's the pattern interrupt. For one brief moment, the investigation is actually aimed right at Dexter, conceptually. They describe a killer with forensic knowledge, access to sealed records, comfort around bodies, a secret life no one sees. That profile is a silhouette that fits him perfectly. But instead of turning their heads toward the lab bench, they swivel toward the most intense detective in the building. So the opportunity passes. The task force glances in Dexter's direction as an abstract possibility, then collectively looks away. Files close, leads shift, and the only person who keeps staring at that silhouette, who refuses to be soothed by Dexter's nice guy act, is Dokes. And that's where the real hunt is about to begin. So while the task force is busy talking theory and profiles, Dokes does what he always does when the room gets too comfortable. He goes rogue. The first thing we need to consider is just how big a line he crosses here. Up to this point, Dokes has tailed Dexter, challenged his excuses, even gotten in his face at crime scenes. But secretly searching Dexter's belongings? That's not just tough cop behavior anymore. That's a career-ending move if he gets caught. However, from Dokes' perspective, this is the only way to turn that vague, creepy feeling into an actual case. In Season 2, Episode 7, when Dexter's distracted and the timing finally lines up, Dokes slips into his place and starts going through the private life of Miami's friendliest blood guy. No warrant, no backup. Just a Special Forces veteran moving through the apartment like it's enemy territory. Drawers, closets, bathroom cabinet, nothing. It almost looks disappointingly normal, which is exactly what makes it so strange. Then he finds the air conditioner. This is where the show gets very quiet. Dokes notices the screws, the slight misalignment, that tiny detail a regular cop would ignore. He pulls the panel off, reaches in, and drags out that small wooden box. No lock, no label, just sitting there like any other harmless keepsake. For a second, you can almost feel him, hoping it's nothing, because if it's something, his whole world changes. He opens it. Inside, rows of glass slides, each one with a perfect, tiny smear of blood. Organized, cataloged, a serial killer's trophy collection, hidden in plain sight. This is not some random stash of evidence. This is ritual. This is private. This is what a predator keeps for himself when the bodies are gone. Dokes' reaction is crucial. He doesn't freak out or shout, he goes still. Years of suspicion suddenly condense into a physical object he can hold between his fingers. Remember, this is a guy who's seen mutilated corpses, cartel executions, war zones, but this is worse, because it proves Dexter isn't just off. He's a killer who celebrates the moment of the kill and then files it away like a souvenir. He doesn't yet know that many of these samples match the dismembered bodies from the Bay Harbor Butcher dump site, but he doesn't have to. The behavior tells the story. Who else but a repeat, methodical killer would build a blood library of victims? And who else has the access, the skill, and a perfect excuse to be around blood all day? For the first time, Dokes has something real, something he can show, something that can blow Dexter's secret life wide open if he can get out of that apartment, stay ahead of Dexter, and live long enough to hand those slides to someone who will actually listen. Because as soon as he closes that wooden box, the game between hunter and hunted changes, and we're about to see just how dangerous it is when Dexter realizes someone has touched his trophies. The second those trophies are touched, the balance of power flips, and Dexter feels it almost immediately. The first thing we need to consider is how fast his brain connects the dots. In that next scene, when Dexter goes to check his slide box and finds it empty, there's no long, drawn-out confusion. No, did I misplace my serial killer souvenirs? He freezes. The mask drops for half a second, and he understands. Someone has found his most dangerous secret. And because this is Miami Metro, and because only one cop has been tailing him like a heat-seeking missile. Dexter doesn't need a task force to figure it out. It has to be Dokes. From there, the case stops being about the Bay Harbor Butcher and becomes a one-and-known hunt. Dexter knows that if Dokes walks into the station with those slides, the investigation is over before he can invent a single creepy excuse. So what does he do? He doesn't wait. He goes on offense. In Season 2, Episode 8, for example, we see Dexter bait Dokes, leading him into isolated spaces, pushing his buttons, testing how far he can drive him away from witnesses. This is where the tactical side of Dexter's double life really shows. He understands Dokes' training, his temper, his special forces background. If he confronts him in public, he's done. If he attacks him sloppily, he's done. So Dexter engineers a situation where Dokes follows him out to the Everglades, far from Miami, far from cameras, far from Deb or LaGuerta or anyone else who might actually believe Dokes for once. However, once he actually subdues Dokes and gets him on that dock, we hit the moral and strategic wall. By Harry's code, Dokes is innocent. He's dangerous, sure. He's pulled the trigger on suspects before, but he's not a secret serial killer. Killing him would break the rules that supposedly keep Dexter from becoming just another monster. You can almost feel Dexter arguing with himself in those moments. Is protecting his own secret worth violating the very code that defines him? Unfortunately for Dokes, Dexter finds a third option that's somehow even worse. Instead of a clean kill, he goes for containment. He locks Dokes in that remote cabin, chains and all, turning him into a living problem to be managed while the Bay Harbor Butcher task force keeps closing in. It buys Dexter time to decide whether he can live with murdering an innocent cop or whether he can find a way to redirect the entire case. And that's the real turning point. The only cop who truly saw Dexter, the one man whose suspicion was deadened from episode 1, is now literally removed from the board. He's alive, he's right, and he's completely powerless. So, how do you turn that into a frame job that convinces the whole department they already caught their killer? That's where the investigation itself becomes Dexter's next weapon. So now we're in that cabin, and the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation basically leaves Miami and moves into 4 wooden walls and a set of chains. The department thinks Dokes is off the grid. Dexter knows he is. And the first thing we need to consider is that this is the only room where the case is actually solved. From the moment Dokes wakes up chained, he's furious, but he's not confused. There's no what's going on. Panic. It's straight to, you're a killer, Morgan. He clocks the plastic, the tools, the way Dexter moves around the space like it's a second home. In any other episode, this would be the part where Dexter plays dumb, throws out a harmless excuse, and walks away. Here, he doesn't even bother. The mask slips, because Dokes has already ripped it off. Dokes starts building the case out loud. He goes back to the blood slides, the strange work absences, the way Dexter was always one step ahead of the Bay Harbor Butcher task force. He's basically reciting the internal affairs report that never gets written. Who else had unrestricted access to all the crime scene photos? Who else knew which criminals slipped through the cracks? Who else was conveniently missing every time a new body showed up? For example, he calls out how Dexter was right there when the underwater dump site was discovered and somehow never looked surprised. This is where he says it plainly. Dexter isn't just a random killer. He is the Bay Harbor Butcher. Dokes connects the trophies to the case profile. Those creepy slides he found, they match the dismembered bodies the divers pulled up. He points out Dexter's medical training, his precise cuts, the way the butcher's victims are all criminals who escape justice. That's not a coincidence, that's a code. And Dokes, with his own special forces background, recognizes organized violence when he sees it. Dexter's response is one of the strangest, most revealing scenes in the entire series. Instead of denying everything, he starts talking. He explains Harry's code, the rule about only killing killers, how he's helping the system. It's partial honesty, wrapped in self-justification. He wants Dokes to see him as a necessary evil, maybe even as a weapon the law can't use. However, Dokes is having none of it. He spits it back in his face. A killer is still a killer, no matter how you dress it up. And this is the tragic punchline. In that cabin, the Bay Harbor Butcher case is effectively closed. One cop has correctly identified the suspect, understood his methods, nailed his victimology, and confronted him face to face. No profile, no task force briefing, no lab report is ever this accurate again. Unfortunately, none of it makes it back to Miami Metro. The truth is trapped with a man who's about to be erased from the narrative. And the next episode will show just how fast Dexter turns this solved case into the perfect cover story. Back at Miami Metro, the silence hits before the story does. We've just seen Dokes solve the Bay Harbor Butcher case in that cabin, but the first thing we need to consider is what everyone else sees. One of their loudest cops suddenly goes quiet. At first, nobody panics. This is Dokes we're talking about. The same guy who tails Dexter without permission, blows up at suspects, and treats the chain of command like a suggestion. So when he stops showing up, the default assumption is that he's gone rogue on some off-the-books angle again. Matthews is irritated, LaGuerta is defensive, and the task force grumbles about being down a man. But the mood is more where's that pain in the ass than our key sergeant might be in a cabin with the real killer. However, his absence starts warping the investigation almost immediately. Remember, Dokes was the only aggressive skeptic in the room, the one openly calling Dexter a creep, while everyone else laughed it off. Take that voice out, and the task force suddenly becomes a lot more homogeneous. The Bay Harbor Butcher profile meetings get smoother, less confrontational, and way more comfortable. That's not a good sign. When nobody is pushing back on the consensus, the case gets blinder, even as it looks more organized on paper. For example, minor anomalies that would have set Dokes off now just get logged and shrugged away. A missing evidence log in time here, a surveillance gap there, a witness who swears they saw a dark SUV near one of the dump sites that just happens to match Dokes' ride. On their own, they're nothing. But because Dokes isn't around to explain where he's been, those little details start clustering around his name. The same rule-breaking maverick reputation that let him chase Dexter now quietly labels him as a problem. The irony is brutal. While the task force is starting to whisper that maybe Dokes is obstructing the case, Dexter is the one juggling a very real secret. A live sergeant, locked in a remote cabin, and a task force meeting schedule that does not care about his hostage situation. So Dexter overcorrects. He shows up early. He volunteers for the boring lab work. He offers helpful, calm explanations in every briefing, careful not to overplay it. If anyone asks about Dokes, Dexter keeps it neutral, almost bored, because any strong reaction would be strange coming from the mild blood guy. And when the narrative needs a villain, who's easier than the vanished cop with a history of shootings and insubordination? Unfortunately for Dokes, the groundwork is already being poured without anyone saying it out loud. The missing sergeant, the aggressive temper, the unexplained absences all sit there, waiting for a story to tie them together. The only question is, who's going to be the first to say what Dexter desperately needs them to believe next? So who's going to be the first to say it? That's the moment this whole thing snaps into place, when the room quietly agrees that the missing, angry sergeant must also be the Bay Harbor Butcher. Dexter doesn't just wait for that story to form, though. He feeds it. The first thing we need to consider is the slides. Those creepy little trophies that have been Dexter's most dangerous secret since episode 1 suddenly become evidence. When Dexter realizes Dokes has broken into his air conditioner and stolen the slide box, he knows two things at once. Dokes is right about him, and those slides can now be used to make Dokes look like the killer. All he has to do is make sure they're found in the right place, by the right people, with the right story already in their heads. That's where the cabin comes in. Dexter's remote kill site, the one where he chains Dokes up, turns into a ready-made crime scene. The propane tanks, the plastic sheeting, the knives, the blood on the floorboards, even the shipping logs he's used to track victims. All of it matches the Bay Harbor Butcher MO perfectly. However, none of that matters unless someone actually stumbles onto it. So we get that anonymous tip, that conveniently timed leak that sends law enforcement straight to the cabin after Leela blows it sky high with Dokes inside. Now they're not just finding a burned building, they're finding a dead cop in the ashes, surrounded by incriminating debris. The slide box survives. The chains survive. The remains of dismemberment gear survive. For example, when they bag those slides and run them against the ocean bodies, it's game over. The lab confirms the slides contain blood from multiple butcher victims. Dokes isn't just near the case anymore. On paper, he is the case. Once that happens, all of Dokes' history gets rewritten in real time. Has officer-involved shootings, has special forces background, the way he's always gone rogue on cases, All the scenes where he's barking at suspects and ignoring orders, suddenly that's not a disciplinary problem. That's a vigilante origin story. People who never liked him can nod and say, of course it was Dokes. The psychological profile the FBI built for a meticulous, mission-driven killer now feels like it was tailor-made for the most aggressive cop in the building, and you can feel the institutional relief. Naming Dokes as the butcher means Miami Metro doesn't have to admit a real killer has been sitting in their lab, untouched, helping run the task force. The brass don't have to explain how their systems missed dozens of murders. They get a clean narrative. A decorated sergeant snapped, used his training, targeted bad guys, and hid behind his badge until he finally blew himself up. Unfortunately, that neat story sticks. The Bay Harbor Butcher case is officially solved, closed with Dokes branded as the monster, while the real butcher walks back into Miami Metro, puts on his lab coat, and starts processing evidence on his own legend. The only question left is, what happens to a killer when the world decides his fall guy is dead and buried? When the world decides the story is over, the first thing we need to consider is who's still alive to argue. In the Bay Harbor Butcher case, that answer becomes no one the second that cabin in the Everglades turns into a fireball. We go from Dexter's secret prison to a full-on war zone in one episode. Dokes is chained, exhausted, but still laser-focused. Still the only cop who has actually heard Dexter admit what he is. Then, Leela shows up. This is the pattern interrupt the case never recovers from. She walks into the scene as Dexter's wild card, sees a bound sergeant next to barrels of dismembered bodies, and makes the worst decision possible: protect Dexter by erasing the witness. Leela opens the gas valves, lets the fumes fill that cramped, creepy space, and calmly leaves Dokes inside with the evidence. There's no debate, no negotiation, just a silent death sentence. When the spark finally hits, the explosion is brutal. The cabin goes up, the bodies cook, and the one man who knew Dexter's full secret is gone in a single violent moment. The show doesn't give us a heroic escape. It gives us a blast that literally blows the truth off the map. The aftermath is where the solution hardens. Search teams move in, and of course, they find exactly what they need to close the case. Charred bodies in bags, matching the Bay Harbor dump, forensic traces linking the scene to the butcher's victims, and Dokes' remains in the middle of it all. From the outside, it looks textbook. A suspected killer flees, hides out in a remote cabin, and dies surrounded by his own trophies. Who's going to argue with that crime scene? For example, everything Dokes had been doing to clear Dexter now gets flipped. His off-the-books surveillance looks like hunting grounds. His aggression toward Dexter looks like misdirection. His special forces past becomes convenient backstory for a disciplined serial killer. Even the fact that he disappeared from Miami Metro right when the task force pressure spiked suddenly reads as flight, not pursuit. What really dies in that explosion is the possibility of contradiction. Dokes can no longer tell anyone about the blood slides he found in Season 2, Episode 10. The way Dexter drugged him, chained him, and calmly laid out his code. Those conversations in the cabin where Dexter basically gives a masterclass on his ritual, gone. No testimony, no alternate narrative, no actually, I was the prisoner. Just silence. Miami Metro's reaction seals it emotionally. There's genuine shock, some grief, but also relief. It's easier to accept that the strange, angry sergeant was a hidden monster than to reopen every assumption about their friendly lab geek. Unfortunately, that's how the human brain files trauma, villain identified, case closed. With Dokes dead and the evidence stacked, the Bay Harbor Butcher file doesn't just close, it calcifies. The real solution is now literally buried with him in the Everglades, which raises the next problem. What does a killer do with that kind of freedom? The first thing we need to consider is how desperately everyone wants this nightmare to be over. Bodies in bags, national headlines, internal panic about a serial killer working under their noses. Miami Metro and the FBI are starving for closure. So when the Bay Harbor butcher case lands neatly on a dead Special Forces sergeant with anger issues, of course they're going to grab that with both hands. We watch Lundy do what he does best: review. He walks through the evidence against Dokes like he's replaying an episode in slow motion. The blood slides found in Dokes' car, the timing of his disappearance lining up with the task force closing in, his combat background, black ops rumors, and the way his file reads like a warm-up act for a killer profile. Plus, his proximity to certain victims, cartel guys, traffickers, people Dokes actually interacted with on cases. On paper, it's almost too clean. However, this is where it gets creepy. Lundy's original profile of the butcher fits Dexter almost perfectly: meticulous, emotionally detached, comfortable at scenes, probably embedded in law enforcement, drawn to blood but hiding behind a nice guy mask. Dokes is the opposite energy. He's rage, not ice. So how does Lundy bridge that gap without reopening suspicion? He starts bending the edges of his own profile. For example, traits he once described as a calm, methodical personality become discipline from Special Forces. The need to observe crime scenes up close turns into Dokes hanging around investigations he's not assigned to. The killer's ability to anticipate police moves, that's now chalked up to Dokes' insider knowledge and rule breaking, instead of asking, who else fits this better? Lundy reframes the details until they sit on Dokes like a slightly wrong-sized suit that everyone pretends fits. And hanging over all of this are the pressures we don't see in a single scene, but feel across the season. The FBI wants a win. Miami Metro needs to prove they're not harboring more monsters. Reopening the case would mean admitting their internal oversight missed a serial killer for years. That's not just embarrassing, it's career-ending. So when Lundy's instincts and the institution's need for a clean story collide, the institution wins. Does he have doubts? Absolutely. We catch it in the way he talks about the butcher with a strange respect, even after Dokes is named. There's a hesitation, a sense that something about the psychology doesn't quite line up with the man who used to shout at Dexter in the hallway. But those doubts never get loud enough to override the slides, the cabin, the explosion, the perfect excuse to close the file. So Lundy signs off. The profiler who almost mapped Dexter's mind walks away believing the case is solved, while the real killer stands in the background at Miami Metro, watching the applause, already wondering what he'll do with all that new freedom next. Dexter gets what every hunted killer dreams of. The task force disbands, the manhunt ends, and the file is stamped closed. But the way it happens? That's the part that never really leaves him. The first thing we need to consider is Dexter's immediate reaction when Lundy signs off and Miami Metro officially crowns James Dokes as the Bay Harbor butcher. On the surface, we see relief. He's alive, he's free, the cabin and the explosion gave him the perfect excuse to walk away clean. However, that relief is welded to something much darker. Dokes' charred body is the receipt for Dexter's survival, and every time someone spits the word monster at Dokes' memory, Dexter is hearing a verdict meant for him. There's this strange detachment in those post-case scenes. Dexter stands in the bullpen while his coworkers trade stories about the butcher they almost worked with every day. For example, when LaGuerta gets that haunted look and insists Dokes wasn't capable of it, we're watching Dexter do emotional gymnastics in the background, nodding along just enough to stay invisible. The world is condemning the wrong man. and the right man is bagging evidence and cracking quiet jokes. Meanwhile, the legend of the Bay Harbor Butcher doesn't die just because the case file is boxed up. It mutates. Miami gets news specials, anniversary segments, creepy true crime graphics of dive teams pulling up those plastic bags. Radio hosts talk about the cop who was secretly a killer. Kids on the street whisper about Dokes like he's the boogeyman. The name Bay Harbor Butcher now belongs to a dead sergeant, not to the unknown Avenger who actually curated that underwater graveyard. Unfortunately for Dexter, that public narrative doesn't stay theoretical. It presses on him every time he takes a new victim. He's still following Harry's code, still targeting people who slip through the cracks, but now he knows his work has a brand, a body count, a task force history. Someone else is paying the bill for every slice of plastic wrap he lays down. So when he sharpens his knives, there's this extra layer of calculation. Is he honoring the code? Or just hiding behind the fact that the Bay Harbor Butcher is already dead on paper? That tension changes how he moves at Miami Metro. After coming that close to exposure, he's more careful with everything. Time cards, excuses, even facial expressions at crime scenes. In Season X, Episode Y, we'd see him clock, who's watching him almost as much as he studies the blood. A stray comment from Masuka, a lingering look from Deb, a file LaGuerta won't let go of. Each tiny moment lands like a warning shot. If anyone starts questioning the official story, the first place they'll look is the blood guy, who is always there. And that's the real legacy of the Bay Harbor Butcher case. On paper, it's solved. In Dexter's life, it becomes this permanent echo. The framing of Dokes doesn't just haunt Dexter's conscience, it bleeds into his relationships with Deb, with LaGuerta, with anyone who refuses to fully buy the narrative. The case is closed, but the lie they all agreed to live with is going to keep cracking open. Season after season, every time someone dares to say Dokes' name out loud, and here's where it gets really uncomfortable. That crack we just talked about, the one that opens every time someone says Dokes' name, Miami Metro learns how to plaster over it, not with truth, but with procedure. The Bay Harbor Butcher goes from living nightmare to office legend, and it happens faster than anyone wants to admit. The first thing we need to consider is how relentless the job is. New bodies show up, new headlines, new scandals. The Butcher file, once stacked in the middle of the briefing room like a bomb, slowly gets pushed to the side by fresher horrors. Detectives transfer out, rookies transfer in, and pretty soon, the Butcher is something you hear about in a break room story rather than a case that keeps you up at night. You should have been here for Bay Harbor, a sergeant tells a new recruit. It's war story energy, not open wound energy. And as the people rotate, the paperwork hardens. Reports, press clippings, internal memos, all repeating the same neat conclusion. James Dokes, rogue cop, secret killer. That repetition matters. Every time an officer pulls the file for a training example or performance review, they're not reading a mystery, they're reading a verdict. Questioning it would mean questioning the judgment of everyone above them, which is a great way to end a career. For example, in a later episode, when the Bay Harbor Butcher is referenced. Notice how casually people say Dokes and Butcher in the same breath. No hesitation. No doubt. The official story has been told so many times that it becomes muscle memory. However, that doesn't mean everyone buys it emotionally. LaGuerta is the clearest exception. She carries the weight long after the rest of the squad has turned it into cautionary folklore. Where others see a closed case, she sees a friend whose file reads like bad fan fiction. You can feel it in those scenes where she quietly reopens old evidence or pushes back against the Dokes as monster narrative, That's not just grief, it's resistance to institutional gaslighting. Most of Miami Metro doesn't have the bandwidth for that. They compartmentalize. Deb buries herself in new work. Batista leans into promotions and policy. Masuka turns it into a dark joke. Because, of course, that's his only real coping mechanism. The Butcher becomes a training slide. Here's how we caught one of our own. Nobody adds the footnote that they didn't. And this is how institutional memory really works. Once a case is officially solved, reopening it demands extraordinary evidence. New bodies. A confession. A forensic miracle. Dexter has engineered the exact opposite. The bodies are gone. The evidence points to a dead man, and the only person who truly knew his secret went up with that cabin. So the Bay Harbor Butcher lives on as a perfectly labeled box in records, while the real killer walks past that file room every day with a coffee in his hand. On paper, Miami Metro won. In reality, the monster they caught is ashes, and the monster they missed is still helping them close cases. On paper, the Bay Harbor Butcher is closed. In reality, the story only goes quiet. And the first person who refuses to let that silence stand is the one who knew Dokes best, Maria LaGuerta. The first thing we need to consider is LaGuerta's connection to Dokes before any of this serial killer talk ever hits his file. They were partners, they were friends, and in season 2, we get those little hints that their history isn't just professional. She knows the guy who would throw himself into a gunfight without an excuse, who would bend rules, but not his core. So when the case ends with Dokes branded as a sadistic vigilante, it doesn't just bruise her ego as a captain. It hits her like a personal betrayal from the universe. At first, she does what everyone else does. She salutes the narrative. Terrorist ties, the cabin explosion, the bodies in the swamp. Open and shut. However, LaGuerta is not wired to ignore splinters, and this case leaves a lot of them. For example, the psychological profile of the Butcher they all built together. Meticulous, patient, cold. That is not the same man who shouts at suspects in the hallway and gets into bar fights on his nights off. She starts noticing timing problems too. Dokes is supposedly out on his own, stalking and killing for months, but his duty logs and travel records don't line up cleanly with the dump site window. There are gaps where he's accounted for. Scenes where he's documented as being somewhere else entirely, while the killer is clearly working. It's not a smoking gun, but it's strange enough that she can't just file it under Dokes was crazy. So she does what LaGuerta always does. When something feels off, she goes back to the paperwork. Quietly, no big announcement, no Task Force 2.0, just late nights in records, rereading Bay Harbor reports, crime scene photos, and interview transcripts. She replays conversations in her head, pulls up old surveillance logs, and starts asking casual questions around the bullpen. Have you ever noticed how little personal life Dokes had? Did anyone actually see him near those dump sites? Why were some of the Butcher's victims tied to other open Miami Metro cases? Of course, she doesn't leap straight to Dexter Morgan is the Bay Harbor Butcher. At this stage, Dexter is still the helpful analyst who lost a colleague and closed the worst case in department history. But LaGuerta's willingness to reopen a dead file makes her a late-game echo of Dokes himself. Where Dokes had raw instinct and special forces paranoia, LaGuerta has politics, pattern recognition, and a refusal to let her friend's name rot under the word monster. Unfortunately for Dexter, that combination is just as dangerous. As she circles the inconsistencies, her orbit starts to drift closer to the one person who benefits from the case staying buried. And the more she tugs at the loose threads around Dokes, the more another name keeps popping up in the margins. Dexter Morgan. The question is not whether LaGuerta will notice that pattern. The real question is how far she'll follow it once she does, and who won't make it out of that discovery alive. And this is where the case stops being just an investigation and turns into a ghost story. Once the file's close and the press conferences end, the Bay Harbor Butcher doesn't stay a line item in a report. He mutates into a legend. The first thing we need to consider is how the media and the public freeze that legend in place. A terrifying serial killer who hunted other killers, with James Doak's face plastered next to every headline as the madman who snapped. On the news, Doakes becomes the shorthand for fear. Archival photos of him scowling in uniform, B-roll of dive teams pulling bags from the water, commentators repeating the same line, decorated sergeant by day, vigilante monster by night. It's clean. It's cinematic. It's also almost completely wrong. Because the story doesn't stop there. Over time, the butcher turns into a campfire myth inside Miami. For example, you can practically hear the off-screen bar chatter the show hints at. You hear about that guy who only killed criminals? Maybe we need him back. Some people romanticize the butcher as a necessary evil, the serial killer who did what the system wouldn't. Others point at the exact same case and go the opposite direction, using it as a cautionary tale about what happens when cops go too far and nobody is watching. Both versions feel satisfying. Neither has much to do with Dexter. Dexter's actual reality is way less operatic and way more chilling. He isn't driven by some noble rage at the justice system. He's driven by an internal compulsion that Harry tried to cage with a code. The victims aren't random bad guys off a talk radio list. They're specific targets he's researched, stalked, and forensically confirmed. In scene after scene, we see how methodical he is. The plastic, the tools, the blood slides. There's no heat of the moment vigilante passion there, just emotional detachment and ritual. That's the part the public never gets. They imagine a rogue cop losing control. What they actually had was a blood spatter analyst who stayed frighteningly in control. Of course, that version doesn't play well on the 6 o'clock news. And then there's the ugliest twist of all. Doak's role gets almost completely erased. In the real story, he's the one person whose suspicion is dead on, the near hero who almost blows Dexter's secret wide open. However, in the official narrative, he's the villain, the cop-turned-killer whose cabin explodes and neatly ties a bow on the whole mess. The man who recognized the darkness is recast as the darkness. That gap between what happened and what people believe is the point. Investigations don't just produce facts, they produce stories. And those stories can be wildly wrong while still scratching that itch we have for closure. The question is, what happens when someone inside Miami Metro starts tugging at the story itself, not just the evidence? Because once LaGuerta stops buying the legend, the Bay Harbor Butcher stops being a myth and starts being a current threat again. So let's zoom out for a second. If LaGuerta is tugging at the story, the first thing we need to consider is, what was the actual case they thought they'd solved? Because on paper, the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force didn't look incompetent at all. In some ways, they built a terrifyingly accurate picture of Dexter without ever saying his name. They nailed the victim pattern. From the moment those trash bags surfaced off the coast, the case files kept circling the same detail. These weren't random civilians. They were criminals. Rapists, traffickers, killers who slipped through procedural cracks. The task force correctly clocked that someone was targeting people the system had already failed. That's why the vigilante motive clicked so fast. This wasn't a thrill seeker. This was a killer using Miami as his own appeals court. They also got the sophistication right. The dismemberment, the plastic, the perfectly clean dump site, it all screamed forensic literacy. This was somebody who understood blood, trace, time of death, ocean currents, not just a guy who watched too much CSI. And they correctly saw the long operational timeline, years of consistent technique, evolving disposal methods, but the same ritual underneath. Whoever the butcher was, he'd been doing this a long time. However, once they had that almost perfect skeleton of a profile, the flesh they put on it was completely wrong. They misidentified the killer. They decided he was an unstable cop, a creepy outlier like Dokes, rather than the quiet lab guy standing in the briefing room. They assumed the rage had to be loud, explosive, obvious. So when Dokes dies in that cabin explosion, the story wraps itself. Tortured veteran snaps, kills bad guys, dies in a blaze. Case closed, threat over. That's where institutional bias and politics really start steering the wheel. The department needs a resolution, the feds need a press conference, and the mayor needs a win. Admitting the real butcher could still be out there, that's career suicide. It's much safer if the killer is a dead cop with a history of violence than a beloved blood spatter analyst whose sister is a decorated detective and whose boss treats him like a kid brother. Personal relationships warp everything. Deb's loyalty, LaGuerta's lingering guilt over Dokes, even Batista's need to believe the badge still means something. All of that pushes the narrative away from Dexter. For example, every strange Dexter moment that Dokes flagged in earlier seasons suddenly gets refiled as proof of Dokes' obsession instead of evidence against Dexter. From a pure forensic and behavioral standpoint, though, they basically drew Dexter's silhouette: access to crime scenes, comfort with blood, detailed knowledge of offenders, an almost creepy calm around death. They had the right job description, the right psychology, even the right timeline. They just stapled it onto the one man who fit their political needs instead of the man who actually fit the evidence. Understanding the Bay Harbor Butcher case means holding both truths at once: the official closure everyone celebrated and the secret reality Dexter walked away with. The real question is, what happens when those two versions finally collide on the same board? And that brings us to the one person whose version of the board never made it onto the wall: James Dokes. The task force had the files, the forensics, the press conferences. Dokes had something a lot messier and a lot more dangerous, a gut feeling that just would not shut up. The first thing we need to consider is how early that feeling shows up. Way back in season 1, before there's any Bay Harbor Butcher label, Dokes is already tracking Dexter with his eyes in every scene. He clocks the strange work absences, the bad excuse at the shipping yard, the creepy excitement at crime scenes. While everyone else hears lab geek, Dokes hears this guy is a killer. He can't prove it yet, but he can almost sense the darkness coming off Dexter. From there, his journey is basically a parallel investigation, running under the official case. When the bodies are found in the ocean and the task force starts building the butcher profile, Dokes is building his own Dexter profile. Same inputs, different output. For example, the victims are all criminals who slipped through the system. The task force calls that a vigilante. Dokes looks at Dexter's blood-spattered genius, his secret cache, his jiu-jitsu training, and connects it to someone who could hunt those specific targets and make them disappear. He follows Dexter, literally. He tails him at night, catches him in lies about narcotics work, pokes holes in every alibi. In one episode, Dexter claims he's doing late lab work. Dokes is already parked outside, watching him leave in the kill shirt. That's not a hunch anymore. That's surveillance. And when Dokes eventually breaks into Dexter's place and finds the blood slide box, the tiny trophies that even the Bay Harbor Butcher task force never knew existed, his suspicion hardens into certainty. Of course, the cabin confrontation is the moment where his version of the case is basically complete. locked in with Dexter in that Everglades cage. Dokes does what no profiler ever manages. He nails the psychology. He calls out the code, the need to kill, the way Dexter hides behind the badge and the lab coat. He doesn't just say you're the butcher. He understands what kind of butcher Dexter is. However, being right is not the same as closing a case. Dokes got there through rule-breaking, illegal entries, unauthorized tails, no warrants, no chain of custody. He never gets the slides logged, never gets a formal statement on record, never survives long enough to testify. Dexter flips the entire narrative, plants butchered bodies and gas cans, and by the time the smoke clears, the only story the institution can accept is the one with paperwork, Dokes as the Bay Harbor Butcher. That's the tragedy at the heart of this investigation. The system caught a version of the killer, but only one man ever truly saw the real one, and he died branded as the monster he tried to stop. The real question now is, what happens when someone else starts following that same forbidden trail Dokes left behind? If Dokes left a forbidden trail, the scary part is how close the official case came to following it by accident. The first thing we need to consider is just how narrow Dexter's margin of error really was. For a guy who calls himself very careful, the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation is basically a highlight reel of near disasters. It starts with the dump site. Once those divers hit the underwater graveyard and the bags come up, Dexter is dead the second anyone connects the plastic, the knots, or the cut marks back to him. And the task force actually gets close. They clock the victim pattern, criminals who slipped through the cracks, people who deserved it. On paper, the profile is almost a perfect sketch of Dexter's code. They analyze the trash bags, the tape, the way the bodies are cleaned. Masuka talks about a meticulous, forensically aware killer. They're circling a blood expert with boat access without even realizing it. Then you add the marina angle. Once they figure out the butcher needs a boat, Miami suddenly shrinks. We get those scenes of Dexter walking the docks, pretending to be helpful, while silently checking if anyone noticed the slice of life. One anonymous tip, one dock worker remembering the strange guy who always goes out at night, and the case is over. However, that never happens. People assume the killer is some shadowy loner, not the guy who brings donuts. Meanwhile, the internal suspect talks are even scarier in hindsight. Lundy's task force debates whether the butcher is law enforcement, maybe even someone in their own building. They're right in theory, completely wrong in practice. They never say Dexter out loud, but the case file is basically screaming his name. And that's before we even get to the personal threats. Dokes' surveillance turns that abstract profile into a human face. He tails Dexter's work absences, calls out every bad excuse, and eventually follows him to those creepy, isolated locations. The kidnapping confrontation in the Everglades, for example, is the moment the show drops the pretense. Dokes doesn't just have a suspicion. He has the blood slides. In Season 2, Episode 10, when he forces Dexter to open that box and seize the trophies, the investigation is effectively solved. A cop has physical proof that the Bay Harbor Butcher is a colleague. Dexter only survives because everything after that is chaos and luck. Dokes gets imprisoned in the cabin, cut off from the very system he was trying to serve. Lila's explosion wipes out the witness, the slides, and the last clean shot Miami Metro will ever have. The institution wants a neat ending, and Dokes is a perfect scapegoat. Violent record, creepy temper, already under suspicion. Of course, the story they accept is the one that fits their biases. The tragic irony is brutal. The closer the case stayed to evidence and victimology, the more accurate it was. The second they attached a name and a face, they got it completely wrong. Dexter walks away, officially helping, close Bay Harbor, while privately knowing the wrong man died for his secret. So, when we look back, Bay Harbor is both Dexter's greatest escape and his deepest unpaid bill. He keeps his life, his job, his family image. But the moral debt, that stays open. The real question is, what happens the next time a case starts to rhyme with Bay Harbor and there's no dokes left to take the fall? So, when we look back at Bay Harbor, we're stuck with this really uncomfortable paradox. On paper, the case is a win. Task force created, killer profiled, suspect identified, files closed. Miami Metro gets a monster off the board. But the first thing we need to consider is that the real Bay Harbor butcher walks away every night through the same doors as the people hunting him. Because in terms of pure detective work, the investigation is actually impressive. They nail the psychological profile. A meticulous, organized killer with forensic knowledge, access to police data, and a moral code targeting criminals who slip through the cracks. For example, when they connect the bodies on the ocean floor to past arrested but released offenders, they're basically sketching Dexter's dark passenger in a briefing room. They just paste Dokes' face on it at the end. There were really 3 pillars that should have crushed Dexter. First, the forensics, the plastic sheeting, the precision dismemberment, the dump site that only someone who understood trace evidence would risk. Second, his perfect instincts and access. He's the blood guy on the very task force, hunting his alter ego, constantly volunteering for overtime, always at the right crime scene with the right insight. And third, Dokes, the one person whose suspicion doesn't fade with a joke or a lab coat excuse. Dokes' gut isn't some magical cop sixth sense. It's an evidence-based read on a man whose mask never quite fits. He clocks the strange work absences, the creepy excitement at gore, the cash, the jujitsu, the abandoned medical track. In Season 2, Episode 10, when he finds the blood slide box in Dexter's air conditioner, that's not a lucky break. That's the final puzzle piece for a picture he's been building since Circle of Friends in Season 1. The system, however, is never willing to validate that read, because admitting Dexter is the killer means admitting the rot is inside the house, and that's where the tragedy feels inevitable. In a world driven by narratives and politics, the messy truth of a secret vigilante embedded in Miami Metro will almost always lose to the clean story of a rogue cop who snapped. A dead Special Forces sergeant with a temper problem is easy to package at a press conference. A beloved blood spatter analyst who's also a serial killer? That breaks the whole show. These people are putting on for the public and for themselves. So, did Miami Metro ever really solve the Bay Harbor butcher case? Or did they just find a story they could live with? How does Dokes' fate sit with you now, knowing how close he came to being right about everything? And does Dexter slipping through Bay Harbor make his eventual downfall feel earned? Or does it make it even more tragic that the one man who truly saw him never gets to see that end? Let us know in the comments and tell us what part of this investigation you want us to break down next. Dexter only survives because everything after that is chaos and luck. Dokes gets imprisoned in the cabin, cut off from the very system he was trying to serve. Leela's explosion wipes out the witness, the slides, and the last clean shot Miami Metro will ever have. The institution wants a neat ending, and Dokes is a perfect scapegoat. Violent record, creepy temper, already under suspicion. Of course, the story they accept is the one that fits their biases. The tragic irony is brutal. The closer the case stayed to evidence and victimology, the more accurate it was. The second they attached a name and a face, they got it completely wrong. Dexter walks away, officially helping close Bay Harbor while privately knowing the wrong man died for his secret. So, when we look back, Bay Harbor is both Dexter's greatest escape and his deepest unpaid bill. He keeps his life, his job, his family image. But the moral debt, that stays open. The real question is, what happens the next time a case starts to rhyme with Bay Harbor and there's no dokes left to take the fall? So when we look back at Bay Harbor, we're stuck with this really uncomfortable paradox. On paper, the case is a win. Task force created, killer profiled, suspect identified, files closed. Miami Metro gets a monster off the board. But the first thing we need to consider is that the real Bay Harbor butcher walks away every night through the same doors as the people hunting him. Because in terms of pure detective work, the investigation is actually impressive. They nail the psychological profile, a meticulous, organized killer with forensic knowledge, access to police data, and a moral code targeting criminals who slipped through the cracks. For example, when they connect the bodies on the ocean floor to past arrested but released offenders, they're basically sketching Dexter's dark passenger in a briefing room. They just paste Dokes' face on it at the end. There were really three pillars that should have crushed Dexter. First, the forensics. The plastic sheeting, the precision dismemberment, the dump site that only someone who understood trace evidence would risk. Second, his perfect instincts and access. He's the blood guy on the very task force hunting his alter ego. Constantly volunteering for overtime, always at the right crime scene with the right insight. And third, Dokes, the one person whose suspicion doesn't fade with a joke or a lab coat excuse. Dokes' gut isn't some magical cop's sixth sense. It's an evidence-based read on a man whose mask never quite fits. He clocks the strange work absences, the creepy excitement at gore, the cash, the jujitsu, the abandoned medical track. In Season 2, Episode 10, when he finds the blood slide box in Dexter's air conditioner, that's not a lucky break. That's the final puzzle piece for a picture he's been building since Circle of Friends in Season 1. The system, however, is never willing to validate that read, because admitting Dexter is the killer means admitting the rot is inside the house. And that's where the tragedy feels inevitable. In a world driven by narratives and politics, the messy truth of a secret vigilante embedded in Miami Metro will almost always lose to the clean story of a rogue cop who snapped. A dead Special Forces sergeant with a temper problem is easy to package at a press conference. A beloved blood spatter analyst who's also a serial killer? That breaks the whole show these people are putting on for the public and for themselves. So, did Miami Metro ever really solve the Bay Harbor butcher case? Or did they just find a story they could live with? How does Dokes' fate sit with you now, knowing how close he came to being right about everything? And does Dexter slipping through Bay Harbor make his eventual downfall feel earned? Or does it make it even more tragic that the one man who truly saw him never gets to see that end? Let us know in the comments and tell us what part of this investigation you want us to break down next.